In the summer of 1944, the ocean turned against them. What had once been a realm of silent hunters became a graveyard of steel. Inside the Japanese submarine I-37, somewhere in the Philippine Sea, a low hum vibrated through the hull, strange, rhythmic, mechanical. It wasn't set a ship. It wasn't set a torpedo. It was something new. Chief Sonar Operator Petty Officer Sato pressed his earphones tighter, trying to decipher the alien pulse. His instruments fluttered with unnatural consistency. For a moment he thought it was an American destroyer, but the pattern was wrong. The sound drifted. It didn't set move like a ship. The captain, Lieutenant Commander Matsuda, crouched beside him. "What do you hear, Sato?" "Sir," Sato replied quietly. "It sets coming from the sky." The men exchanged glances. The sky. In all their years patrolling the Pacific, the ocean had been their ally, vast, concealing, infinite. But now something from above was finding them, through the water itself. What Sato had heard were the first American sonar buoys, floating sentinels of sound that turned the ocean into a vast listening device. They didn't set chase submarines. They simply listened and told the hunter where to strike. To the Japanese submarine fleet, this was sorcery, a technology they didn't yet understand and couldn't escape. The I-37 had been ordered to intercept Allied convoys near Leyte, but that night, as they drifted silently beneath the surface, they realized something chilling. Every move they made, every vibration, every breath of the engines was being heard. The sea, once their cloak, had become their betrayer. It was the beginning of a new kind of war, not fought with guns or courage, but with sound, science, and the invisible waves beneath the surface. And for Japan's submarine crews, it marked the moment they realized the ocean was no longer theirs. Before the echoes of sonar haunted their nights, Japan's submariners believed the ocean itself favored them. They were the Kaigan Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Imperial Navy's silent hunters, trained to stalk distant prey across an empire that stretched from Manchuria to the Solomons. In the early years of the Pacific War, Japan's submarines were marvels of engineering, large, fast, and with incredible range. Unlike their German allies who focused on sinking merchant convoys, Japan's doctrine envisioned submarines as part of a fleet engagement strategy. They were to cripple enemy warships before battles, clear the path for carrier assaults, and sever the arteries of American logistics. Their first kills were spectacular. The cruiser USS Indianapolis damaged, the carrier Saratoga torpedoed, Allied ships hunted in the Java Sea and off Hawaii. For a time, the Imperial Navy's submariners believed they could strangle the American fleet. They called it Senkan no Mei, no Yami no Senso, the war in the darkness before the battles. But soon, darkness itself began to change. By 1943, the United States had unleashed an oceanic revolution, technology as a weapon of survival. New sonar systems, magnetic detectors, radar-equipped patrol planes, and later, sonar buoys, devices that could be dropped from the air to listen for the faintest hum of a submarine, reshaped naval warfare. The Japanese, with limited access to advanced electronics and industrial capacity stretched thin by the war, struggled to adapt. While American destroyers and aircraft carriers multiplied, Japan's submarine fleet dwindled, both in number and relevance. Their proud commanders, once masters of stealth and patience, were forced to confront a terrible truth. The enemy could now see through the sea. Still, the Imperial Navy clung to its doctrines. Submarine crews continued long-range missions, often without air cover, outdated sonar or radar warning gear. They relied on instinct, courage, and ritual. Before every patrol, they bowed to the sea, believing it would protect them. But the ocean no longer obeyed them. Each month, more submarines vanished without a trace. Families back home received only silence. "The Americans do not fight men anymore," wrote Sub-Lieutenant Hiroshi Kondo in 1944. "They fight with ghosts. The sea listens to them, the air sees for them, and we are left to die in the dark." By the time the I-37 left port on her final mission, Japan's submarine force was already broken in spirit. They did not yet know about the floating buoys, those invisible ears dropped from the sky, but they could feel their reach. Each patrol felt shorter, each silence heavier. The men no longer trusted the sea sap's quiet. Because in the stillness, the Americans were listening. Every submarine is a world unto itself, a floating village of men sealed in steel, surrounded by darkness, bound together by silence. Aboard the I-37, 39 souls shared that world. They were not faceless soldiers. They were sons, husbands, brothers. And they all knew that if death came, it would come quietly. Among them was Petty Officer Sato, the sonar operator who first heard the strange American pings. He was 23. Before the war, he had been a fisherman in Kyushu. He used to say that the sea spoke to him. Now, he said, it screamed. Beside him was Chief Engineer Tanaka, a father of two who kept a photograph of his children taped above the control panel. The humid air often peeled the corners of the photo. Each night, Tanaka carefully flattened it again, a small act of defiance against the chaos of war. And there was Captain Matsuda, a quiet man who still bowed to his crew before every dive, a remnant of an old samurai code, long eroded by the mechanized brutality of the Pacific. He believed in discipline, in honor, in the idea that to die unseen beneath the waves was to serve Japan in purity. But even he was beginning to doubt the sea's mercy. Each man carried a piece of home in his breast pocket, a folded letter, a charm from a temple, a clipping from a newspaper. They were tokens of another life, the life they had left behind when they chose the sea. In those long nights of silence, when even breathing felt too loud, they spoke in whispers. What do you think it sounds like when a depth charge hits close? Do you think the Americans are afraid too? Do you think they still remember us? There were no answers, only the rhythmic pulse of the sonar and the haunting knowledge that the Americans no longer needed to see them to destroy them. They lived in constant negotiation with fear. Every new sound from above could mean death. A single air bubble escaping through a faulty valve could betray their position. A wrench dropped on the deck could summon a destroyer. They slept in shifts, ate rice mixed with mold, and recycled every breath they took. The air grew thick with sweat, oil, and dread. And yet, there was courage. Not the kind sung in songs, but the quiet courage of men who continued their duty, even when they knew the ocean had turned against them. Matsuda Thep's last entry in the ship Thep's log reads simply, "The ocean no longer belongs to us. But we must still listen, and learn its voice again." He didn't know how prophetic those words would become, because within days, that voice would return, louder, clearer, and more merciless than ever. The Pacific night was endless. The I-37 drifted at 120 feet, her diesel engines silent, her batteries slowly draining. For hours nothing moved, until the silence itself began to hum. Sato, the sonar operator, stiffened. "Captain, the sea is speaking again." A rhythmic pattern echoed through the headphones. Ping, 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 softer than before, but coming from every direction. It wasn't Stet a destroyer. It wasn't Stet depth charges. It was something scattered, listening. Captain Matsuda leaned close. "How far?" Sato swallowed hard. "Everywhere, sir. It's all around us." Overhead, American aircraft patrolled the empty skies. They carried a new weapon, and /CRT-1, a Sonar Buoys, each one a floating ear connected by radio to listening aircraft. Together they formed invisible nets of sound, grids of listening points that could triangulate the position of a single submarine by the faintest echo. To the Japanese crews below, these buoys seemed supernatural, ghostly devices falling from the heavens. The sea itself was betraying their presence. The first explosions came hours later, distant, probing. The Americans weren't firing blindly anymore. They were testing. Engineer Tanaka shouted from below. "Pressure rising. They said dropping charges to herd us." Matsuda gripped the periscope column. His instincts screamed to dive deeper, but he knew the limits. Below 300 feet, the hull could crumple like paper. Instead, he ordered silence. "Hold your breath," he whispered. Let the sea think we are dead. For 20 minutes, no one moved. Even the electric fans were cut. The submarine became a tomb of stillness. But silence was no longer safety. Sound waves didn't need noise. Even the hum of machinery, the creak of metal, or the heartbeat of the ocean could betray them. The Americans were perfecting a new kind of hunt, one that no amount of bravery could counter. Science was now their weapon. Sato, Intercepts closing in, multiple buoys responding. Matsuda, all ahead slow, starboard 2 degrees, prepare for crash dive. The sub groaned as it descended, bubbles streaking past the portholes. Depth gauges spun, the hull creaked like an old ship in a storm. Then, a sound no submariner ever forgets, the deep vibrating thud of a depth charge detonating nearby. The shock wave slammed through the hull. Men were thrown against steel walls, tools and maps scattered. The lights went out. Water began seeping through a cracked valve. Tanaka rushed to seal it, his hands shaking. Matsuda steadied himself, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. He looked at Sato. What are they using, petty officer? Sato's voice was barely a whisper. Not ships, sir. It seps the ocean itself. It seps listening. That night, for the first time in the Pacific War, a Japanese submarine crew realized that human sensors were no longer enough. They were fighting an enemy that hunted with mathematics, electricity and sound. The war beneath the waves had changed forever, and the hunters were now the hunted. The depth charge had torn open a wound in the submarine's stern compartment. Salt water hissed through cracked seams, spraying across the machinery. The I-37 was bleeding into the sea. Chief Engineer Tanaka and his men scrambled through waist-deep water, wrenching valves, hammering bolts. Every sound echoed like a scream. Every vibration risked giving their position away. Keep it quiet, Tanaka shouted. If they hear us, they still come back. But silence was impossible. The ocean pressed in from every direction. At 280 feet, the hull began to flex. Steel popped and groaned like the ribs of a dying beast. Captain Matsuda clung to the periscope housing, blood still on his brow. His crew looked to him, eyes wide, waiting for orders that might mean life or death. He opened his logbook with trembling hands and wrote just 4 words. The ocean is hostile. He had been trained to fight enemy ships, not the sea itself. Now the ocean was the enemy, vast, intelligent, relentless. Before each mission, families gathered at the dockyards in Kura or Sasebo. They believed the ocean would cradle their sons, carry them home like a mother's arms. But beneath the waves, that promise dissolved. Every Japanese submariner knew the truth. No one dared speak. If your sub was hit, you did not surface. You did not surrender. You sank with honor. The Americans had found them again. Depth charges rolled from a destroyer's stern, descending like metal rain. Sato shouted over the noise. They sep bracketed us, sir, fore and aft. Hard to port, dive to 300, Matsuda ordered. The helmsman hesitated. Sir, the hull. Do it. The sub plunged, groaning, rivets popped. Water burst through a fractured seam, spraying across the control room. For a moment the I-37 seemed to hold together. Then a deafening crack echoed, a sound like a mountain breaking underwater. Pressure slammed through the compartments. A valve blew open. Steam hissed violently. When the flood doors jammed, Seaman Nakamura stayed behind. He knew the rules. The compartment had to be sealed, or everyone would drown. He nodded once at Tanaka through the small glass window. Then he smiled, a small, calm smile, and raised his hand in farewell before the water swallowed him. Tanaka turned the wheel. The door sealed with a final metallic click. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely speak. Tanaka, forgive me. That moment broke something inside the crew. Discipline gave way to despair. They weren't soldiers anymore, just men waiting to see who the sea would claim next. Matsuda stared into the darkness of the control room. The air was hot, heavy with oil and fear. He whispered to himself, almost like a prayer. If the sea is listening, Let it remember us kindly. But the sea did not remember them kindly. The pings drew closer, circling, precise. The enemy above had learned to hear through the water, and now there was nowhere left to hide. The I-37 lay wounded in the dark. Her engines were silent, her crew exhausted, her oxygen nearly gone. Death was close, but so was clarity. In the eerie stillness, Captain Matsuda finally understood the enemy's weapon. It wasn't stet power. It wasn't stet numbers. It was listening. The Americans weren't chasing them blindly. They were mapping the echoes, creating a pattern of sound where silence used to be their shield. And if sound could betray them, perhaps sound could also save them. If they hear us through the ocean, then we must let the ocean lie for us. He called for Engineer Tanaka and Petty Officer Sato. The three huddled together, whispering above the hum of the leaking pumps. Matsuda's idea was as bold as it was desperate, to create a false echo. They would release debris and oil to the surface, cut all power, and use one final mechanical burst to simulate a dying submarine's implosion, a decoy of sound to lure the Americans away. It was a deception of silence, a gamble with death. The crew moved like ghosts. Sato recalibrated the hydrophones to time the buoy responses. Tanaka prepared the compressed air tanks for a controlled discharge, the false implosion. Every movement had to be perfect. They couldn't speak above a whisper. Even a dropped wrench could end them. If this fails, Captain, the pressure will crush us before the Americans do. Then we die on our own terms. They released the oil and debris, scraps of wood, empty shells, a torn flag. Through the hydrophones, the sound of the ocean shifted. The sonar buoys above began to sing back, confused, scattering their signals. Then, with a deep breath, Matsuda ordered the final act. Now, release the charge. A muffled thump rippled through the hull, the controlled burst mimicking a hull implosion. The sound expanded through the water, echoing upward. Moments later, the sonar pings above changed. They spread outward, hunting the phantom of a dead submarine. They soared, moving away. A long silence followed. No pings, no explosions, only the faint groan of the sea. For the first time in days, the crew exhaled. They had fooled the ocean, or at least, the men who listened through it. In that moment, Matsuda realized that survival in this new ocean wasn't about strength or honor, it was about understanding. The sea had changed, and only those who could listen differently would endure. But his relief was fragile. They were alive, yes, but their batteries were dying. Oxygen was low, and the path home was long. And above them, the Americans would soon learn from this deception and return even more prepared. The I-37 had won one more night, but in the new age of sound, victories like these were borrowed time. The false implosion had worked, for now. Above, the American aircraft drifted east, convinced they had destroyed their target. But below, in the silent dark, the I-37 clung to life. The submarine was crippled, half her systems damaged, batteries down to 15%. Oxygen levels were dropping fast. If they didn't surface soon, the sea that had spared them would finish what the Americans had begun. Captain Matsuda studied his maps by candlelight. His hand trembled slightly as he traced a course, a winding route along the Mariana Trench, where cold, deep currents could mask their acoustic signature. It was the only way home. For the men aboard, survival had become ritual. Every breath was counted. Every sound, forbidden. They spoke with their eyes, not their voices. Sato, the sonar operator, pressed his earphones tight, listening to the faint hum of the world above. He could hear the pulse of the buoys fading, distant, intermittent. The net was thinning. There was a chance. Captain, the sea is quiet again. Matsuda nodded. Then we move, slowly. They advanced at barely 2 knots, slower than a drifting current. Every vibration was a risk. But in the deep slowness was invisibility. Engineer Tanaka monitored the oxygen scrubbers, their filters blackened, efficiency fading. The air grew heavy and metallic, tinged with the faint scent of oil and human breath. Some of the younger sailors began to hallucinate, whispering to people who weren't there. One man claimed he could hear the ocean talking back. Another kept murmuring the same line. "We should have stayed on the surface. We should have died with the sun." Matsuda looked through the periscope. For the first time in days, he saw stars again. The ocean above was calm, but it no longer felt like home. It was enemy territory, a vast sky of water filled with unseen ears. Still, he ordered the crew to prepare for a brief surface run. The batteries needed air. The men needed hope. The I-37 rose slowly from the depths. Salt spray crashed over the deck as the conning tower broke through the surface. Men gasped for air, each breath sharp, painful, alive. For a brief moment, the Pacific was silent. Stars shimmered above. Then, a distant drone. Aircraft, closing fast. Crash dive, now. The sub plunged once more into the dark. But this time, something was different. The Americans weren't dropping depth charges. They were listening again. The deception had bought them hours. But it had also taught the enemy. The Americans had learned to distinguish a true implosion from a false one. And they were now closing the circle. Below, Matsuda could feel the ocean tightening around them, the low hum of sonar nets recalibrating. He looked at Sato, then at his crew, and knew. They had reached the edge of escape. They had fought with silence, cunning, and courage. But the ocean, vast, ancient, impartial, was shifting toward a new master. The age of invisible hunters was ending. The I-37 had been running blind for 30 hours. Her crew, dehydrated, delirious, drifted between hope and despair. And now, from every direction, the ocean began to sing again. It was no longer random. The pings came in patterns, layered and intelligent, like a hunter tightening its net. Sato, the sonar operator, realized what was happening. The Americans had linked their sonobis through a new system. Each buoy was talking to the next, triangulating every echo, every vibration. Their silence was no longer protection. The sea itself had turned against them. Captain Matsuda ordered the sub deeper. 500 feet. 600. 7. The hull began to sing, a terrible, bending wail. Engineer Tanaka. She shall collapse at this depth, Captain. Matsuda didn't answer. His eyes were on the sonar display. The ocean had become a constellation of hunters. Then, the unmistakable sound. A new pattern of pings. Faster, sharper, coordinated. They found us. Above, the sky trembled with violence. Explosions rippled through the depths, water hammering against steel like fists of God. Inside the I-37, lights flickered, pipes burst, and the crew clung to one another in the strobing red glow. Every blast threw them against the bulkheads. Every moment stretched eternity. Forward ballast tanks hit. Tanaka shouted. Battery flooding. Seal the compartments. Keep her level. But the ocean no longer cared. Some men began to write. Short, trembling letters to wives they'd never see again, children they'd never hold. They tucked them into waterproof tubes, as if the ocean might one day deliver them home. One sailor scribbled, "Tell them we fought in silence, and that the sea forgot our names." Then, it stopped. The pings faded. The explosions ceased. For a fleeting moment, they thought they had escaped again. But the silence was worse. It meant the Americans had locked in their final coordinates. They were waiting. Matsuda stood in the command room, drenched in sweat. He knew what would come next, a final wave of charges, precise and fatal. He turned to his crew. Prepare to surface. Gasps filled the control room. Surface meant capture. To the Imperial Navy, that was unthinkable. But Matsuda was done feeding men to a machine that no longer belonged to them. The war has taken enough ghosts. We will not become more. The I-37 surfaced at dawn. The Pacific greeted her not as a friend, but as a witness. On the horizon, a U.S. destroyer loomed, guns trained but silent. Through his binoculars, an American officer watched as the Japanese crew climbed out, one by one, hands raised, eyes hollow. No shots were fired. For Matsuda, surrender was not defeat. It was acknowledgement that courage had changed form. That survival, too, could be a kind of honor. As the Americans approached, the captain looked back at the sea and whispered a final transmission that would never be sent. The ocean is no longer ours, but it still remembers us. When the I-37 surfaced, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield, it was a graveyard. The American destroyer USS England approached cautiously. Its crew expected a trap. Instead, they found men, sunburned, bleeding, half-conscious, standing silently on deck, hands raised toward the rising sun. These were not the faceless enemies from propaganda reels. They were sailors defeated, yes, but dignified in their surrender. Captain Matsuda was the last to leave his submarine. Before stepping onto the American ship, he looked down into the open hatch, into the dark that had been his world, and saluted. The Americans watched in silence. Then he turned and handed over his sword. U.S. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hale, who accepted the surrender, later wrote in his diary, "He looked at me, and in that moment I saw not a fanatic, but a man who had outlived his own ocean." The Americans treated the survivors humanely. They fed them rice, gave them blankets, and allowed them to wash the salt and oil from their skin. It was the first kindness many of them had known in months. One young Japanese sailor wrote later in a POW journal, "The enemy who hunted us gave us bread. The ocean took everything, but returned our humanity." The Americans studied the I-37 carefully. They learned how the crew had tried to mimic an implosion. They noted how quickly the Japanese had adapted, how inventive they had become, even in desperation. But there was something more valuable than machinery or maps. Through interrogation, quiet, respectful conversations, they began to understand the enemy's mindset. To the Japanese submariners, silence was not just a tactic, it was faith. Faith that the deep would protect them, that the unseen currents still belonged to their empire. That faith died with the I-37. By the end of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost more than 130 submarines. American sonar, radar, and air patrols turned the Pacific into a trap. Every innovation that had once made Japan a formidable naval power was now obsolete. The sea, their greatest ally in the early years of war, had become the domain of their enemies. In the months that followed, Matsuda rarely spoke. He would sit for hours watching the ocean beyond the wire fence, as if waiting for a sound that no longer came. In a letter to his wife, one that survived, he wrote, "They call it the Pacific. Peaceful. But I think the sea only looks calm because it has swallowed too many voices." The wreck of the I-37 was never found. But sonar operators, decades later, sometimes report strange echoes near her last known coordinates, faint metallic taps too rhythmic to be random. Perhaps it's just the sea remembering. Or perhaps, as some believe, the ghosts of those who fought in silence still whisper beneath the waves. The Pacific is vast. It holds secrets older than empires, deeper than battleships, and heavier than the memories of men lost beneath its waves. For the crew of the I-37, that ocean was once a sanctuary. It was their battlefield, their shield, and their home. But by 1944, the tides had shifted. The hunters became the hunted. And in a war driven by sound and steel, the very sea had turned against them. The story of I-37 is more than a tale of tactical innovation or the horrors of undersea warfare. It is the story of men confronting an invisible enemy, an enemy that was part nature, part technology, and part inevitability. They faced choices no human being should ever have to make. To fight silently against an unstoppable tide, to sacrifice themselves for honor, or to live on burdened with the memory of comrades lost. And they survived, if only for a moment, through courage, ingenuity, and the quiet defiance of hope. Captain Matsuda and his crew became more than soldiers, they became symbols of resilience. They remind us that war is not only measured in victories or defeats, but in the human will to endure, to adapt, and to retain dignity when the world seems bent on erasing it. Even today, the legacy of sonar warfare, of undersea strategy, and of invisible battlefields reminds us technology may change the way wars are fought, but courage and humanity remain timeless. The ocean still listens. It remembers the taps of rivets in the hull, the whispers of orders, the final letters tucked away for loved ones. It remembers Sato, Tanaka, Nakamura, Matsuda, and every man who sailed silently beneath the waves, facing death not with anger, but with dignity. And if we choose to listen carefully, perhaps we can hear their echoes too. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more echoes of history. Because history is not just a record of battles and dates, it is the story of real people, real courage, and the lessons that still ripple through the waves today. Remember, the sea may change, technology may evolve, but the human spirit in war and in peace is eternal.